The proximity alarm did not give me a warning. It gave me 3 seconds. 3 seconds between the moment the Vreth warship emerged from the dust ring of Karath 7 and the moment it locked a targeting sensor onto my hull. I know this because my ship's threat board lit up in a solid wall of red before I had finished reaching for my coffee. The coffee went sideways. I did not reach for it again. My name is Lena Voss. I am 38 years old. I am a former Sergeant Major of the Earth Fleet Marine Expeditionary Division, which means I spent 11 years learning how to do dangerous things calmly. Then I retired, bought a used cargo freighter with a cracked heat shield and a personality fault in the navigation computer, and spent the next 4 years doing something safer, running coolant deliveries to Outer Rim refinery colonies. That is what I was doing this morning. That is what I was supposed to still be doing. The Vreth warship was 4.1 kilometers long. I know the exact measurement because my ship's identification scanner pulled its classification profile in the first second and a half of contact. It was a Dominion-class Grand Carrier, which is the sort of vessel that does not travel alone and does not chase single cargo freighters. It chases fleets. It breaks orbital stations. It ends wars. It had found me. The reason it found me was sitting in my cargo bay, strapped between 2 crates of enzyme coolant in a sealed diplomatic canister, about the size of a large backpack. I did not know what was inside it at the time. I only knew that a woman named Cora Fell had handed it to me 40 minutes ago in the docking corridor of Karath 7 station, and that she had been bleeding when she did it, and that she had looked me in the eye with the absolute stillness of someone who has already accepted what is happening to them, and she had said 3 words. She had said, "Don't stop running." Then she had pressed her palm to my cargo manifest scanner to log the transfer as a standard diplomatic consignment, and she had walked back toward the station interior, and that was the last time I saw her. The station's emergency lockdown had sealed 12 minutes after I undocked. By then I was already past the dust ring approach vector and running a routine engine check, and then the Vreth warship came out of nowhere. This is the thing about Karath 7 that most freight pilots know, and the Vreth Dominion apparently chose to ignore. The system's primary dust ring is not a passive debris field. It is a compressed band of magnetic particulate thrown off by the system's dying secondary star about 800 years ago. The particulate is fine enough that it does not register on most long-range sensors, but dense enough that anything moving through it generates a charge buildup on its hull, a charge buildup that a properly calibrated passive scanner can detect. My scanner was properly calibrated. It was the first thing I had fixed when I bought the immovable Miriam, because the previous owner had let it drift, and I once saw a calibration failure get a freighter pilot killed when she did not notice an armed escort following her into a custom zone. So I detected the charge signature before the Vreth ship fully cleared the ring. That gave me an extra 2 seconds on top of the 3 I already had. 5 seconds total. That is not much time by any reasonable measure. It is, however, exactly enough time to initiate a cold burn lateral burn and move the Miriam 40 meters to port, which meant the targeting lock that the Vreth computer had established was now pointed at empty space. In 5 seconds I had moved. They had to reacquire. That bought me 22 more seconds. In those 22 seconds I did 4 things. I killed the running lights. I rerouted all non-essential power to the main drive. I locked down the cargo bay so that the diplomatic canister was secured against impact. And I pulled up the system navigation chart and looked for options. There were not many. Karath 7 is a frontier system. It has 1 inhabited body, which is the refinery colony on the 3rd moon of the gas giant, and that colony is currently in lockdown. It has 1 transit lane, which is the approved freight corridor leading back toward the core systems, and that lane runs directly past the position of the Vreth warship. It has 1 other feature worth noting on the navigation chart, which is the gravitational gradient that forms between the gas giant and its innermost moon during the conjunction period. The conjunction period had started 14 minutes ago. It would last for another 2 hours and 7 minutes. During a conjunction, the gravitational gradient creates a slingshot corridor, a narrow channel where a ship can use the competing gravitational forces to accelerate to jump velocity in about 60% of the time it would normally take. The corridor is narrow. The timing has to be precise. Most pilots will not use it because it requires flying close enough to the gas giant's outer atmosphere that the heat becomes a concern. and because the gravitational stress on a ship's frame during the acceleration phase is the equivalent of about 4 times standard gravity for approximately 90 seconds. Most pilots will not use it. I used to use it for training runs when I was with the fleet, because we were taught to know every gravitational feature of every system we operated in, and because Sergeant Elias Crow, who trained my cohort, believed that a pilot who had never used a slingshot corridor was a pilot who would panic the first time they needed one. I was not panicking. I calculated the entry angle. The Vreth warship was behind me, and to my starboard side. If I turned toward the gas giant and ran straight for the slingshot corridor, they would have a clear firing solution on my port flank for approximately 4 minutes. That was the problem. A Dominion-class Grand Carrier carries 7 classes of long-range ordnance. Most of it would reduce the Miriam to a scattered debris field before I reached the corridor, so I did not run straight toward it. I ran in the opposite direction first. I swung the Miriam hard to starboard and away from the gas giant, directly toward the outer edge of the dust ring. The Vreth ship adjusted, tracking me. For 40 seconds I flew directly toward them, which is a thing that most vessels do not do when a Vreth warship is targeting them, and I could see their targeting solution shifting because their computer was expecting me to evade, and flying straight at a threat is not evasion. It is, according to most tactical manuals, the opposite of evasion. What it is, if you do it correctly, is misdirection. At the 40-second mark I cut the main drive completely and fired the attitude thrusters at maximum. The Miriam rotated 90 degrees in just under 2 seconds. The main drive came back online. I was now pointed directly at the gas giant, and I had enough lateral velocity from my previous course that I was already moving perpendicular to the Vreth ship's firing line. They had a targeting solution built for my original course. By the time their system adjusted to my new heading, I had covered 1,100 meters. Their first shot went wide by about 200 meters. I felt it as a pressure wave against the hull, a low vibration that shook the coffee mug off its magnetic pad and sent it bouncing across the cockpit floor. The second shot, which came 6 seconds later, was closer. It lit up the heat sensors on my port side and gave me a warning tone that I silenced with one hand while I adjusted my approach angle with the other. I was in the slingshot corridor entry zone. I could feel the gravitational gradient beginning to pull on the ship, a very slight but unmistakable asymmetry in the forces acting on my frame. The Miriam is not a military vessel. She weighs 47,000 tons loaded, and her frame was built to handle standard transit stresses. Slingshot corridors put non-standard stresses on a ship's frame. I had run the calculation for this particular corridor during the 22 seconds I had bought myself earlier. The Miriam could handle it, probably. I entered the corridor. The gravitational forces caught me immediately. The acceleration was not gentle. It felt like the ship was being picked up by something very large and pulled forward, and simultaneously compressed from the sides. The frame groaned. I heard something shift in the cargo bay, which was alarming, but the diagnostics showed the canister was still secure. So I redirected my attention to the navigation display and focused on keeping the entry angle correct. The angle has to stay within a tolerance of about 3 degrees, or the gradient spits you out the side, and you either lose your velocity advantage, or, in worse cases, you get pulled too far into the gas giant's outer atmosphere. At that point, you have other problems. I kept the angle. The Vreth warship had not followed me. It was holding position at the edge of the dust ring, which told me something important. It told me that whoever was commanding that vessel had recognized the slingshot corridor and made a decision. The decision was that a cargo freighter attempting an unscheduled slingshot jump under gravitational stress was unlikely to survive the attempt. The decision was that the problem would solve itself. That is a reasonable decision. Statistically, it was probably the correct one. The Miriam's hull temperature rose to 112% of nominal over the next 73 seconds. The frame stress indicator climbed into the yellow zone and nudged the edge of the orange zone twice. The gravitational acceleration pushed me back into my seat, hard enough that reaching the controls required deliberate effort. One of the coolant canisters in the forward cargo section broke its secondary tie-down and went rolling across the deck, and I listened to it bang against the bulkhead with the patient calm of someone who cannot do anything about it and knows this. Then I was through. The gravity released me on the far side of the gas giant like a sling releasing a stone. My velocity was 4.2 times what it had been when I entered the corridor. The jump drive, which under normal circumstances requires about 18 minutes to spool to readiness, had received enough velocity from the corridor to compress that time to just under 7 minutes. 7 minutes was a long time. 7 minutes was enough time for the Vreth warship to calculate my exit trajectory and reposition for another shot. I spent those 7 minutes doing 3 things. I ran a damage assessment on the Miriam, which showed frame stress at elevated but acceptable levels, the detached coolant canister, and a hairline crack in the secondary viewport seal that was not an immediate problem but would need fixing. I resecured the diplomatic canister in the cargo bay because during the slingshot pass, it had shifted 6 inches from its original position, and I wanted it locked down, and I thought about what Cora Fell had said to me. Don't stop running. I had not asked her what was inside the canister. I had seen her injury, and I had seen the specific way she moved, which is the way of someone who has already made peace with a very bad situation, and I had not asked any questions because I recognized that there was no time, and that questions were not what she needed from me. What she needed from me was someone who would take the canister and go. I had done that. Now I was 7 minutes from a jump to the next system with a Dominion-class Grand Carrier somewhere behind me, and a diplomatic canister in my cargo bay that was apparently worth deploying one of the most powerful warships in the Vreth Dominion to recover. During minute 3 of the 7, the Vreth warship appeared on my long-range sensors again. It had repositioned. It had also, based on the drive signature I was reading, gone to full acceleration, which meant it was trying to close the distance before I jumped. It was not going to make it. The numbers were very clear on this point. They needed to cover 340,000 kilometers in approximately 4 minutes, and their maximum acceleration in this gravitational environment gave them a closing speed that fell short by about 120,000 kilometers. I watched the numbers tick down with the same focused attention I gave to every calculation that mattered, and I confirmed that yes, they were not going to make it, and yes, I was going to jump, and yes, I was going to be in the next system before they could do anything about it. The jump drive spooled to readiness at 6 minutes and 48 seconds. I did not wait the remaining 12 seconds. I punched the jump as soon as the board showed green. The stars collapsed into lines. In the half second between normal space and jump space, which most people describe as nothing, and which I experience as a very faint sense of the universe briefly going sideways, I had one clear thought. Cora Fell had known this was going to happen. She had known the Vreth would come. She had known that handing the canister to a random freight pilot was not a safe choice. It was just the only choice she had left. She had found me in that corridor, because I had been the only pilot currently undocked, the only person she could reach, and she had trusted me with something that was apparently worth deploying a fleet over. That meant what I was carrying was important. Important enough that the Vreth Dominion had sent their largest class of warship to stop it from leaving the system. I did not know what was inside the canister. I knew that a dying woman had trusted me with it. I knew that it was now in my cargo bay, secured between 2 crates of enzyme coolant, and that I was in jump space, heading for the next system, with a Vreth Grand Carrier behind me, that had almost certainly already transmitted my description and my ship's registry to every Vreth installation in range. I was not military anymore. I was a freight pilot with a cracked viewport seal and a slow coolant leak in the starboard engine housing. I was also, as of approximately 40 minutes ago, apparently the most important courier in the outer rim. I reached down and picked up the coffee mug from where it had ended up against the base of the pilot seat. It was empty. I set it back on the magnetic pad. The navigation display showed 11 hours to the jump exit point. 11 hours before I came out on the other side in Palavin's Reach, which was the next system on my standard run, and which had an Ansible relay and a refueling station and, most importantly, a population large enough that a single cargo freighter would not stand out. 11 hours gave me time to think, to plan, to figure out exactly what I was carrying and what I was going to do about it. I pulled up the canister's registered manifest on my cargo system. Cora Fell had logged it as a standard diplomatic consignment, sealed under Union protocols, destination listed as the Interstellar Conclave Station at Vethmore, which was 12 systems from here. 12 systems. I sat with that number for a moment. Then I set a course calculation running for Palavin's Reach and started the secondary engine diagnostic. The coolant leak was going to need attention. The frame stress readings needed to be logged before anything else set in. There was real work to do. and I have always found that doing real work is the most reliable way to keep thinking clearly when everything around you has stopped making sense. I was a freight pilot. I had a delivery to make. The destination was 12 systems away, and there was a Vreth Grand Carrier somewhere behind me that very much did not want me to get there. Those were the facts. I arranged them in my mind the way I arrange cargo manifests, clearly and in order, and then I started working through them one at a time. The first thing I needed was to survive the next 11 hours of jump transit without any additional problems. The second thing I needed was to understand what I was carrying. The third thing I needed was to figure out who else knew about it, because the Vreth had not arrived at Karath 7 by accident. Someone had told them the canister was there. Someone had told them when it was being transferred. That meant someone had also known about Korafel, and about the transfer, and about me. That was the thought that stayed with me for a long time, quiet and persistent at the back of everything else I was doing. Someone had talked, which meant I could not trust the Ansible relay at Palaven's Reach to be clean, which meant I could not contact Earthfleet Command without risking the transmission being intercepted, which meant I was going into the next system alone, with no backup and no safe communications, carrying something that an empire had decided was worth starting a hunt over. Fine. I had done harder things. I checked the frame stress readings one more time, confirmed the secondary tie-downs were holding in the cargo bay, and settled in for 11 hours of jump transit, with the steady, unhurried focus of someone who has learned that the best response to a very large problem is to handle the small problems first, one at a time, until the large one comes into range. Outside the ship, jump space pressed against the hull in its strange, colorless way. Ahead of me, 11 hours away, was Palaven's Reach, and whatever was waiting there. I did not know yet what was waiting there, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I was not going to stop. Palaven's Reach did not look like a trap. That was what worried me. I came out of jump space at the system's outer marker and held the Miriam in passive drift for 6 minutes before doing anything else. 6 minutes of listening to the sensor returns, watching the traffic patterns, reading the communication frequencies for anything that felt wrong. From the outside, Palaven's Reach looked exactly like it always did, a mid-tier system with 2 inhabited stations, a busy commercial lane running between them, the usual scatter of freight and passenger vessels going about their business. Nothing that pointed at me, nothing that felt staged. The Vreth warship had not preceded me. That was the first thing I confirmed. The jump routes between Karath 7 and Palaven's Reach are fixed by the system's gravitational geometry, and the entry zones are widely separated, and I had come in at the freight transit entry, rather than the standard approach vector, which would not help me if someone were already here waiting, but would tell me something if the entry zone showed warship residue. It did not. The sensors were clean. I moved the Miriam in slowly, running on half thrust, with my transponder broadcasting my registered identity, without any attempt to hide. Hiding was the kind of thing that drew attention. A cargo freighter running normal. That was ordinary. That was invisible. The secondary engine coolant leak had gotten worse during the 11 hours of jump transit. I had patched it twice with the materials I had in the maintenance locker, and both patches had held for about 2 hours each before the pressure differential defeated them. The third patch I had put on 3 hours before exit was holding, but I could hear the faint hiss of it under stress whenever the engine output rose above 60%. The Miriam was going to need a proper repair stop, and she was going to need it before too long. The navigation computer had given me a fault warning at hour 7 of the transit. The fault was in the tertiary routing module, which handled the supplemental nav calculations for systems I was not currently traveling through. It was not a critical system. It was also the system that stored the backup star charts, the ones I had plotted by hand during the first year of running this route, the ones that accounted for all the gravitational quirks and traffic patterns and unofficial approach vectors that did not appear on the standard commercial charts. I use paper charts. I keep them in a sealed flat drawer below the main console. 37 pages of them, plotted in pencil on heavy drafting paper, updated whenever I learned something new about a system. Several pilots I know find this funny. A few of them have told me directly that it is a waste of time, that the nav computer handles everything, that I am being irrational. I have never found a good short answer for why I keep the paper charts, except that I once saw a navigation computer failure leave a crew drifting in a dead system for 9 days before rescue reached them, and after that, I decided that having a backup that could not fail because it had no moving parts was not irrational at all. In Palavin's Reach, at hour 2 of my approach to the refueling station, the primary navigation computer went fully offline. Not a fault warning, not a degraded mode, fully offline. A complete system drop, which the diagnostic traced to a cascade failure in the power distribution array that fed the nav computer's primary and secondary cores simultaneously. Both cores, at the same time, from the same power disruption. The probability of that happening by chance was low enough that the word chance stopped applying. Someone had installed something in my system, something designed to wait until I was moving through a populated system with traffic to blend into and then take down my navigation, because a freighter without navigation in a busy commercial lane was going to have to stop, was going to have to ask for assistance, was going to have to announce its position in a way that could be tracked. I did not announce my position. I pulled out the paper charts. Palavin's Reach, page 14. I knew this system well enough that I had updated these charts 3 times in the last 4 years. I could read the gravitational lanes from the contour lines I had drawn in pencil, could find the approach vectors from the reference marks I had made against the station positions. I did not need the navigation computer to fly through a system I had memorized. It took me 40 minutes longer to plot my approach to the refueling station manually than it would have taken with the computer. During those 40 minutes, I also ran a diagnostic sweep of every system on the ship, looking for anything else that did not belong there. The sweep turned up 4 tracking nodes. They were small, about the size of a coin each, and they had been attached to the interior of the hull at 4 points that were separated enough from each other to give a strong triangulated signal, regardless of the ship's orientation. Tracker spores. That was the informal name for them. They were Vreth military technology, designed to be deployed at close range and adhere to a vessel's hull without the crew noticing. The design was elegant. Each node was coated in a material that mimicked the electromagnetic signature of common hull alloys, which was why standard passive scanners missed them. You had to run an active sweep with the gain set high to find them, and most pilots only did that kind of sweep in a maintenance bay. I found them because I was looking, because I had been thinking about how the Vreth had arrived at Kareth 7 so quickly and so precisely, and the only explanation that fully accounted for the timing was that they had been close to the station before I left it, close enough to deploy nodes when I docked, close enough that they already knew where I was when Cora Fell handed me the canister. They had not been chasing me to Kareth 7. They had been waiting there. I docked at the refueling station using the manual charts and my own experience of the approach corridor, and I paid for fuel and a maintenance bay slot with the commercial credit account that I use for all routine transactions. There was nothing unusual about my arrival. I was a freight pilot with a navigation fault, asking for a maintenance slot, which happens several times a week at every station in the Outer Rim. In the maintenance bay, with the station's work lights overhead, I removed the 4 tracking nodes, using a maintenance scraper and a magnetic retrieval tool. They came off the interior hull cleanly. I set them on the workbench and looked at them for a while. They were active. I could tell because they were putting out a low-frequency ping that my handheld scanner could just barely detect. I did not destroy them. Destroying them would tell the Vreth they had been found, and that would tell them something useful about me. Instead, I attached them, one at a time, to the hull of the automated cargo drone that was parked in the adjacent bay. The drone was registered to a logistics company based in the core systems and was on a transit route that would take it in the exact opposite direction from where I was going. The ping would continue. The Vreth would track it. They would track it all the way to the core systems, and they would eventually find an automated drone with nothing in it. That would cost them time. While the maintenance crew worked on the coolant leak and the navigation computer, I sat in the station's public terminal area with a mug of tea I had bought from the service counter, and I thought very carefully about the next step. The Ansible relay at Palavin's Reach was operational. I had confirmed this from the station's public communications board. I could send a message. The problem was that I did not know how compromised the relay was. Standard procedure for Vreth intelligence operations, which I had studied extensively during my time with the fleet, included the routine monitoring of Ansible relays in systems of interest. Palavin's Reach was on the Outer Rim, but it was a transit hub, which made it a system of interest. Any message I sent through the relay was potentially being read. I composed the message carefully. I addressed it to Gwen Harrow, who is my freight broker in the Delphi Station hub, and has been my broker for 4 years. The message read, running behind schedule due to nav fault at Karath 7, rerouting through alternate path. Please advise current transit fees for the conclave route and confirm any schedule conflicts. Thank you. There was nothing in that message that mentioned the canister or the Vreth or Corafel. There was also nothing in it that mentioned my actual intended route. But Gwen Harrow is not just my freight broker. She was, before she left the fleet 2 years before I did, the intelligence liaison officer for the 14th Transit Division. She knows how to read a message that says one thing and means another. The word alternate, and the mention of the conclave route, and the reference to Karath 7 would tell her exactly what she needed to know without telling anyone who was reading our message traffic anything useful. Whether she could actually help me from her office at Delphi Station was a different question, but she was the only contact I had who might be both clean and useful, and sending the message cost me nothing. The navigation computer was back online by the time I returned to the Miriam. The maintenance tech told me the power distribution issue had been traced to a component fault in the array coupling, which was a plausible explanation, and also a complete fiction, because I had already located the actual cause, which was a small interference module wired into the coupling that had been designed to cause the specific kind of cascade failure the computer had experienced. I said thank you, paid the maintenance fee, and removed the interference module myself after the tech had left. I kept it. I wrapped it in insulating cloth and put it in the bottom of the tool locker. Evidence. The Terath neutral zone was 3 systems from Palavin's reach. I had been to the zone 3 times before, for refueling and cargo transfer. The Terath are a careful species. They maintain strict neutrality in all political conflicts, and they run their stations with a level of administrative precision that most other species find excessive. Everything is documented. Every vessel, every passenger, every cargo item, every transaction. Their systems are thorough and their staff are professional, and their stations are among the safest places in the Outer Rim to conduct business. They are also, as I was about to learn, absolutely terrified of the Vreth. I arrived at the Terath station at the edge of the neutral zone in a standard commercial transit configuration and docked without incident. The station was busy. There were 7 other freight vessels on the dock, plus 2 passenger transports and a scientific survey ship. I got into line at the administrative counter, presented my documents, and was in the process of registering my cargo manifest when the station official across the counter from me went very still. His name tag said Aaron Val, which was a Terath-style designation, and he had the careful, composed face that Terath officials generally wear. But something had broken in that composure. His eyes had moved from my cargo manifest to his terminal screen and back, and his hands, which had been moving through the administrative process with practiced efficiency, had stopped moving entirely. He looked at me for a moment without speaking. "Is there a problem with the manifest?" I asked. He leaned very slightly forward. He spoke in trade standard, which is the commercial lingua franca of the Outer Rim. His voice was quiet enough that I had to pay attention to hear it. "Sergeant Major Voss," he said. "I am a civilian freight pilot," I said. "Former rank." "Yes," he said. "I understand." He glanced at the terminal again. "Your vessel has been flagged in the Vreth Dominion's Grand Hunt Register. This flag was placed in our incoming vessel database approximately 6 hours ago. A Grand Hunt declaration has been filed for your ship and for you personally." He stopped. Then he said something that I did not expect, something that fell outside the careful administrative script of a Terath official. "I am sorry," he said. "That is all I can tell you within the terms of our neutrality agreement." I did not respond immediately. I was absorbing the information. A Grand Hunt declaration. That was not the same as a standard pursuit order. The Vreth Dominion's Grand Hunt is a cultural and military institution with a history going back to their pre-spaceflight era. It is declared only under specific conditions, which are listed in the Vreth Military Code, and it is binding on every officer and vessel in the Dominion fleet. Once a Grand Hunt is declared, the Vreth are obligated to pursue until the target is captured or destroyed. There is no cancellation. There is no negotiation. There is no clock running down. There is only the hunt. They had declared it for one freight hauler. For me, I was now, by the standards of the Vreth Dominion, the most formally significant fugitive they had named in my lifetime. The Terath official was waiting. His composure had returned, but it had a fragile quality. the composure of someone holding themselves together carefully, because the alternative was worse. "How many vessels are currently involved in the hunt declaration?" I asked. He checked his terminal. 17, he said, as of the most recent fleet registry update. 17 warships, for one cargo freighter, for me. I thanked him, took my cargo manifest back, and walked back to the Miriam. I did not hurry. Hurrying would have drawn attention, and I needed the 2 minutes of walking time to arrange what I now knew into something I could work with. 17 ships, all bound by the Grand Hunt, which meant all legally required to pursue me, regardless of the political cost to the Dominion, which meant the Vreth had decided that whatever was in my cargo bay was worth the political cost of mobilizing 17 warships in neutral and allied space. In the cargo bay of the Miriam, I opened the secured compartment and looked at the diplomatic canister. It sat there between the enzyme coolant crates, sealed, silent, and apparently worth the full military attention of an interstellar empire. I put my hand on the seal reader. A standard diplomatic canister uses biometric authentication from the registered sender and the registered recipient. Cora Fell was the registered sender. The interstellar conclave was the registered recipient. The seal would not open for me. I had known this, but I had tried anyway, because sometimes knowing a thing and confirming it are different enough that it is worth the effort. The canister did not open. I went back to the cockpit and looked at the system's map. The Turath neutral zone would not give me shelter. The Turath were neutral, which meant they would not help the Vreth directly, but it also meant they would not help me. They had already told me as much in the careful language of their official. My presence was a problem for them, because the Vreth would apply diplomatic pressure to the Turath administration, and the Turath would have to respond to that pressure within the limits of their neutrality. And those limits did not include harboring a Grand Hunt target. I needed to move. I needed to move quickly, and I needed to move to a system where I had some kind of advantage or resource that I did not currently have. The systems ahead of me on the route to the conclave were not all good options. Some were heavily Vreth influenced. Some were too small and too sparse to hide in. Some required transit paths that would bring me directly through known Vreth patrol corridors. But there was one option. About 4 systems ahead, at the edge of the outer drift, there was a region called the Ashenvale Corridor. It was not a transit hub. It was not a commercial center. It was a cluster of asteroid mining operations run by independent contractors, with a complex gravitational environment created by 3 mid-sized bodies orbiting each other in a way that made navigation there genuinely difficult. The kind of difficult that military ships, which are optimized for open space operations, handled badly. A freight pilot who had spent years learning difficult gravitational environments might handle it considerably better. I was filing my departure from the Turath station when my communication system flagged an incoming message. It was addressed to my freight code, which was the identifier I used for commercial communications, and it had been routed through 3 relay points before it reached me, which was the kind of routing that added time and complexity for the specific purpose of making the origin harder to trace. The message was from Gwen Harrow. It was 4 lines long, and it was, on its surface, a completely ordinary commercial communication about transit route fees. But if you read the first word of every other sentence, which was a code that she and I had established 3 years ago for exactly this kind of situation, it said, "Don't trust the relay. They're watching. You have something they cannot let reach the conclave. Keep moving. Help is coming, but it is far." I read it twice. Then I deleted the incoming message, cleared the receive log, and finished filing my departure. Help was coming. Gwen had confirmed that someone in the fleet or the conclave support network knew what was happening and was trying to respond. But it was far. Far meant I was on my own for the next portion of this, which was not different from what I had already concluded. The Miriam undocked from the Turath station cleanly. I felt the slight resistance of the docking clamps releasing, and then the familiar settling of the ship into free space. And I ran the pre-transit checks with the routine efficiency of someone who has done this 10,000 times, and I pointed the nose of the Miriam toward the next jump point and started building velocity. On the station's observation deck, according to what I found out much later, the Turath official named Aaron Val had watched my departure from a viewport. He had watched the Miriam until it was too small to see, and then he had turned to a colleague and said something. His colleague had written it down. The translation, as it came to me much later through a very indirect route, was, "She did not hesitate." Aaron Val had sounded, according to the colleague's account, slightly confused by this. As if hesitation were the natural and expected response to being declared a grand hunt target by 17 warships, and the absence of it required explanation. I did not know this at the time. I was already building jump velocity and thinking about the Ashenvale corridor and running fuel consumption calculations because I had 3 systems to cover before I got there, and the coolant repair at Palavin's Reach had cost me more of my reserve budget than I had expected. Practical problems. That is where I live. That is where I have always lived. Everything else is just noise that has to be managed around the practical problems. I jumped. The Vreth defector had been hiding in my cargo bay for 11 hours before I found him. I found him because I went to check on the enzyme coolant canisters during the transit to System 4, and when I opened the cargo bay door, he was sitting on the floor between the coolant crates and the diplomatic canister, with his knees pulled up and his hands visible, because he clearly understood that a human finding an unexpected passenger in a confined space was more likely to react well if the hands were visible from the start. He was Vreth. That was unmistakable. The Vreth are tall, lean-framed, with a banded coloration on their skin that shifts between gray and deep amber depending on their stress levels. This one's banding was very dark, which in Vreth physiology indicates either sustained anxiety or the kind of controlled calm that comes right after sustained anxiety. His hands were empty. His posture was still. He was watching me with the flat, steady eyes of his species, which have no visible pupils and catch light in a way that takes some getting used to. I stood in the doorway for about 4 seconds, running a fast assessment. No visible weaponry. Civilian-style environmental suit, not military issue, though military capable. Physical size was consistent with a mature Vreth male. He had been in my cargo bay for long enough that he had figured out how to adjust the temperature controls in the bay to a level comfortable for his species, which required accessing a panel behind the starboard storage unit. That was not easy to find. He had found it. I said, "You have been on my ship for 11 hours. He said, in trade standard that was slightly formal but clear, "Yes." Without my knowledge. "Yes." "And you chose now to let me know you were here." He tilted his head, which is a Vreth gesture that translates roughly as acknowledgement of a fair point. "I chose now because we are approaching the Ashenvale corridor, and I have information that will affect your approach decisions. I judge this to be more important than the awkwardness of the current situation." I walked into the cargo bay and sat on one of the coolant crates. I kept him in front of me and kept the bay door open behind me, which gave me room to move if this went in a direction I did not want it to go. "Tell me your name." "Eshkar," he said. "I was a communications intelligence analyst. 2nd grade. I served on the Vreth Grand Carrier that was positioned at Kareth 7. He paused. "The carrier that was sent for you. You were on the warship." "Yes. I was on the warship. I am no longer on the warship. I reached your vessel during the 7 minutes between your slingshot exit and your jump, when the carrier came close to firing position. I used an emergency transit pod from the carrier's lower deck. The pod matched your hull long enough for me to transfer." He said this with the matter-of-fact tone of someone reporting a completed administrative task. "The pod is gone. I am here." I thought about that. I thought about it carefully. The carrier's crew knows you're gone. They know a pod was ejected. They may have concluded it was a malfunction. They may have concluded otherwise. Either way, I am not aboard the carrier, and if they track the pod, they will find it on a trajectory away from your vessel, because I corrected its course after the transfer. "Why?" I said. "Why defect? Why now?" He looked at the diplomatic canister. He looked at it long enough that the answer to my question became clear before he said a word. Then he said, "Because I know what is inside that." I waited. "I processed the intelligence intercepts surrounding it," he said. "I know why the Grand Hunt was declared. I know what the Dominion cannot allow the Conclave to receive." He paused again. "And I disagree with what my government has done. There is a thing that happens when someone tells you something like that. A certain number of possible interpretations line up in your mind, and you have to evaluate each one quickly. The first interpretation is that they are telling the truth. The second is that they are a plant, put on your ship to gather information or manipulate your decisions. The third is that they are telling the truth about some things and lying about others, which is the most common category of deception, because it is the most difficult to detect. I evaluated all three. I did not reach a definitive conclusion. In the absence of a definitive conclusion, I applied the standard intelligence analysis rule that Elias Crow had taught me in my second year with the fleet. When you cannot determine intent, focus on capability. What can this individual do to you right now, regardless of their stated purpose? Eshkar was unarmed. He was in a confined space. He had made himself visible at a moment of his choosing, rather than at a moment of mine, which indicated some level of control over the situation, but also indicated that making himself visible was what he wanted, not what he was forced into. He spoke calmly and with specificity, which is the pattern of someone who has organized what they want to say. He was not an immediate threat. He might be a long-term one. The distinction mattered. I said, "Tell me about the Ashenvale corridor." He blinked. I think he had expected me to press harder on the content of the canister. He adjusted. "The Vreth fleet has repositioned since Kareth 7, he said. "I was part of the communications team. The Grand Hunt declaration went out 4 hours after you jumped, and fleet elements were redistributed to cover the most likely transit routes. There are 3 Grand Carrier-class vessels in a blocking formation at the edge of the corridor's standard approach zone. They are waiting at the coordinates where any vessel would naturally exit jump and begin the deceleration approach." "Standard approach zone," I said. "Yes." "You said the most likely transit routes. The standard approach zone. Those are coordinates derived from the standard navigation charts." "Yes." "I don't use standard navigation charts." He looked at me for a moment. "I know," he said. "I saw your paper charts through the cargo bay access port when you were working in the cockpit. I also saw that you navigated Palavin's Reach without the computer during the navigation fault." He paused. "That is why I am talking to you now, instead of waiting until the corridor." I understood what he was saying. He had assessed me too. He had spent 11 hours in my cargo bay making his own determinations about whether I was someone worth talking to, and he had arrived at a positive conclusion, and now he was presenting what he knew in exchange for what he needed. What he needed was to get to the conclave. Same as the canister. Same as me. "The 3 blocking vessels," I said. "What are their patrol patterns?" He told me. He was thorough. He had memorized the fleet positioning information with the precision of a communications analyst who was accustomed to retaining exact coordinates and timing sequences. He gave me the standard approach zone positions, the patrol sweep radii, the sensor coverage overlap regions, and the gap that existed between the eastern sweep of the second carrier and the western edge of the third carrier's coverage. The gap was narrow, about 40 kilometers, which sounds large until you consider that we were talking about navigating through it at approach velocity, in a gravitational environment that was already complex, using paper charts, in a ship whose secondary viewport seal had a hairline crack. But it was a gap. It existed. "You're sure of this information?" I said. "I transmitted it before I left the carrier," he said, "as part of a communications systems test that I scheduled and ran myself. The data was accurate when I left. Fleet positioning in the corridor may have shifted, but the blocking formation is strategic, not tactical. They will not abandon it for minor adjustments." 40 kilometers, I said. "Approximately. My ship is 38 meters wide." "I am aware." I was quiet for a moment. "There is a secondary gravitational channel in the corridor that the standard charts don't show. It runs between the 2 mining asteroids designated KV-7 and KV-11 in the Independent Contractors Registry. It is not on any official navigation document because the contractors who use it have not filed it with the Outer Rim Transit Authority. They use it for quick transits between mining sites, and they have no particular reason to share it." He was listening very carefully. "If I enter the corridor through that channel, rather than the standard approach, I bypass the standard approach zone entirely. I come out approximately 200,000 kilometers inside the blocking formation's inner perimeter, inside the gap you described." "That is a very narrow entry corridor," he said. "Yes, and you know it from your paper charts." "I know it from having flown it twice. The charts are from the first time. The second time was to verify the charts." He processed this. "When did you fly it?" "About 2 years ago. I was carrying equipment for a mining contractor who was behind schedule and needed a faster delivery than the standard route allowed. He told me about the channel. I agreed to try it." I paused. "It works. 2 years ago, the channel was clear," Eshkar said. "Mining operations shift. The asteroids may have moved. They move slowly. The gravitational relationship between KV-7 and KV-11 is stable. They're in a co-orbital configuration, with a drift rate of about 2 degrees per standard year. In 2 years, the channel has shifted by 4 degrees. I've already recalculated the entry angle for current positions. He was quiet for several seconds. Then he said, "You have already planned this." "I've been planning since I picked up the Grand Hunt flag in the Turath zone," I said. "The corridor was always the best option. I was going to need more information about the fleet positions to know if it was a viable option. Now I have that information." He looked at me with his flat, pupil-free eyes. The banding on his skin had shifted slightly, toward the amber end of the spectrum, in Vreth physiology that indicates something close to respect, or its equivalent. I had read enough Vreth cultural analysis during my fleet service to recognize the shift without being certain of its exact meaning. "What do you want from me?" he said, "in exchange for what I've told you?" "Nothing yet," I said. "Stay out of the way while I'm flying. Don't touch any ship systems without asking. If you know something useful, tell me. If you don't know something and you pretend you do, I will know, and that will end our arrangement immediately. And in exchange, I reach the conclave." "In exchange, you reach the conclave," I said. "If I reach the conclave, which I intend to do." He nodded. A Vreth nod looks slightly different from a human nod, a brief forward inclination of the head with the chin leading rather than the forehead, but the meaning is the same. It was an agreement. I went back to the cockpit and started plotting the approach to the Ashenvale corridor through the KV-7 and KV-11 channel. The calculations were not simple. The channel required a very specific entry angle, and a velocity correction at 2 points during the transit, to stay within the gravitational shadow of KV-7, which was what kept you hidden from the kind of long-range sensors the Vreth Grand Carriers used. Too fast and you drifted out of the shadow. Too slow and you lost the momentum needed to exit cleanly on the other side. I had done it twice. The memory of the angles and the feel of the corrections was in my hands as much as in my mind, which is a different thing from knowing something theoretically and a better thing for flying purposes. The 3 Grand Carriers were ahead of me in standard formation, 24 ships total in the hunt now, according to the last fleet positioning information HFY had. 24 warships for 1 freight hauler. I had been running the math on this at the back of my mind for the last several hours, the way you keep a calculation running in the background when you're not ready to look at it directly. 24 ships meant the Vreth Dominion was spending extraordinary military resources on this pursuit. Extraordinary resources meant extraordinary stakes. The canister in my cargo bay was not carrying something minor. It was carrying something that the most militarily capable empire in the Outer Rim could not afford to let reach its destination. I thought about what HFY had said. I know what is inside that. I know why the Dominion cannot allow the Conclave to receive it. He had not told me. I had not asked. I had filed the question away for later, when I had time, and when the trust between us was grounded in more than a mutual claim to the same destination. But I was thinking about it. The entry to the KV-7 and KV-11 channel required precise positioning 30 minutes before I got there. I ran the entry calculation 3 times and confirmed the same result each time. Then I reduced speed to the velocity the channel required and adjusted my approach heading by 11 degrees. From the cockpit I could hear HFY in the cargo bay. He was being quiet. He had taken my instruction not to touch ship systems seriously. He was sitting on the cargo bay floor, I assumed, in the position I had found him in, waiting with the patience his species was known for. I had read a study once, during my fleet service, about Vreth behavioral patterns in extreme situations. The study had been written by a xenopsychologist attached to the diplomatic corps, and one of its key findings was that the Vreth, as a species, do not respond to prolonged uncertainty the way humans do. Humans under prolonged uncertainty tend to either seek resolution or degrade. We become anxious, or we become fatalistic, or we develop a kind of brittle humor that is really just anxiety, wearing a different face. We are not good at sitting still in the middle of unresolved situations. The Vreth are different. Prolonged uncertainty activates a state in them that the study described as readiness suspension, which is essentially a deep patience with a sharp edge. They can hold themselves in a state of complete operational readiness for extended periods, without the degradation that would affect a human in the same situation. This meant that HFY, sitting in my cargo bay, was not waiting in the way I would wait. He was ready. He had been ready since he decided to make himself visible. He was simply holding that readiness without it costing him anything. I found this useful to know. It told me that whatever happened in the next several hours, he would respond quickly and without panic, which was the minimum requirement for a second person on a ship running an unauthorized approach through a gap in a military blocking formation. The Ashenvale corridor was visible on the long-range sensors now, a region of complex gravitational returns that looked, on the display, like a smeared watercolor of overlapping curves. The standard approach zone was at the far edge of it. The KV-7 and KV-11 channel was at the near edge, barely distinguishable from the background noise of the asteroid field. I called back into the cargo bay. "Strap in. There's a restraint seat on the starboard wall." I heard him move. I heard the click of the restraint engaging. "This will take about 22 minutes, I said. "I need quiet." "Understood," he said. I entered the channel. The gravitational shadow of KV-7 settled over the Miriam, like a hand closing around the ship. The sensors went partially blind, which was the point. What blocked the Vreth sensors also blocked mine to some degree, and I was flying on the paper chart and on memory, and on the specific feel of a ship moving through a gravitational field that has its own character. The Miriam felt it through her hull. I felt it through the ship. 11 minutes in, I made the first velocity correction. Too much, initially, and I had to compensate by half. The correction brought us back into the shadow cleanly. I could hear Eshkar's restraint creaking slightly as the gravitational forces shifted during the correction. 16 minutes in, I could see, on the narrow slice of sensor data that was getting through the shadow, the edge of the second Grand Carrier's patrol sweep. It was exactly where Eshkar had said it would be. The gap was exactly where he had said it would be. The mathematics of it were holding together the way mathematics does when the input data is correct. At 19 minutes, the channel opened. I came out of the gravitational shadow of KV-7 into the interior of the corridor, which is a region of relatively cleaner space between the asteroid belt and the 3 co-orbital mining bodies. The sensor picture clarified immediately. 3 Grand Carriers in blocking formation, exactly as described. The near edge of the second carrier's sweep was 43,000 kilometers to my port side. The near edge of the third carrier's coverage was 41,000 kilometers to my starboard side. I was inside the gap. I was in the clear space between them, and they were pointed the wrong direction, watching the standard approach zone. I did not accelerate. Accelerating would generate a drive signature that would register on their passive sensors even at this range. I stayed at the velocity I had held through the channel, which was low enough to produce a drive signature below the detection threshold at this distance. I flew through the gap at the speed of a ship in no particular hurry, going nowhere in particular, for 41 minutes, until the blocking formation was behind me and I was inside the corridor proper. Only then did I bring the drive up to full output and begin building jump velocity. On the sensor board, none of the 3 Grand Carriers had moved. None of them showed any change in configuration. They were still watching the standard approach zone. I set the jump destination, confirmed the drive readiness, and looked at the communication log. The Ansible relay in this system was active. I had a signal. I sent a compressed, encrypted burst transmission to the relay, addressed to Gwen Harrow's secondary contact code, which would take approximately 40 hours to route to her, but would do it through a relay chain that the Vreth found difficult to monitor. The message contained one piece of information: the contents of the canister's registration header, which I had pulled from my cargo manifest. Not the contents of the canister itself, just the fact that a registered diplomatic consignment existed, was in transit, and was targeted by the Vreth Grand Hunt. The relay logged the transmission at 14:33 System Standard Time. I jumped at 14:34. Behind me, in the Ashenvale corridor, 3 Grand Carriers were still watching an empty approach zone for a freight hauler that was already gone. I thought about the communication I had just sent, and about who would eventually read it, and about what they would do with the information. I thought about 24 warships, and a declared Grand Hunt, and a diplomatic canister sealed shut against everyone except its sender and its intended recipient. Then I stopped thinking about what I could not control, and went back to what I could. 5 systems to the conclave. Fuel reserves at 62%. Coolant holding steady. Frame stress within tolerance. Eshkar in the cargo bay. Strapped in and quiet. Worth something or not. Trustworthy or not. But currently the only other intelligent being on this ship. which made him a factor I was going to have to keep working with. 5 systems. I had made it through 3. The middle part of any long haul is always the one where you have to be most careful, because the beginning gives you adrenaline, and the end gives you destination. But the middle is just work. I am very good at work. By the time the galaxy noticed what I was doing, I had already done most of it. The leak came from the Turath station, specifically from the communications log that Aaron Val, the station official, had filed according to Turath administrative protocol, which requires documentation of all significant events on station premises, including the registration of any vessel flagged under a foreign power's Grand Hunt declaration. The Turath file their administrative logs in a shared neutral registry, because transparency is a core principle of their neutrality framework, and the neutral registry is accessible to diplomatic observers from every species that has signed the Outer Rim Accord. A journalist from the Kelhari Information Collective accessed the registry as part of a routine scan for diplomatic activity in the Outer Rim systems. She found the filing. She found the Grand Hunt flag. She found the name of the flagged vessel and its pilot. She found the fact that the vessel had departed the Turath station 11 minutes after being informed of the flag. She published it. Within 36 hours, the story had propagated through every major information network in the Mid-Rim. I know the timeline because Eshkar was monitoring the public information channels on the Miriam's communication receiver, which was one of the ship systems I had told him he was permitted to use, and he began briefing me on the coverage during our transit through System 5. The coverage was extraordinary and deeply inconvenient. The initial framing was what Eshkar described as the novelty angle. 1 cargo freighter, 1 human pilot, 24 warships, a declared Grand Hunt. The numbers were arresting enough that the story spread without needing much additional context. Every species in the Mid-Rim had its own cultural lens for this kind of situation, and every lens produced a different interpretation, but all the interpretations agreed on one thing: what was happening was unusual. Notably, persistently, inexplicably unusual. The Kelhari ran a comparative analysis. They pulled historical records of previous Grand Hunt declarations and cross-referenced the military assets deployed in each case. 24 vessels was the 3rd largest fleet deployment in the Hunt's recorded history. The first 2 had been against actual military incursions. The 3rd largest, now, was against a single freight hauler piloted by a single human. The Kelhari analysis asked a question that got widely shared. What is she carrying? I would have liked to answer that, but I still did not know. System 5 was the Orith Passage, a transit corridor used primarily by the independent mining and salvage operations that worked the asteroid-dense region between the Mid-Rim and the outer systems. It was not governed by any single authority. It had no central administrative body. What it had was a dense scatter of small stations, contractor depots, equipment caches, and the kind of informal communication networks that develop wherever people are doing difficult work, far from any oversight. The kind of people who work the Orith Passage do not, as a rule, respond well to large military formations moving through their operational space. The Vreth fleet had moved elements into the passage. I knew this because Eshkar was tracking the public positioning signals that Vreth military vessels are required by their own protocols to broadcast when operating in neutral territory. 14 vessels were in range, spread across the standard transit corridors. The standard transit corridors were not where I was going. The Orith Passage has an internal navigation problem that has never been fully solved by any computational system, which is that the asteroid density and the gravitational interference from the scattered mass make predictive modeling unreliable beyond about a 48-hour window. The positions of significant bodies shift frequently enough that any chart is partially outdated by the time you use it. Pilots who work the passage deal with this by running continuous sensor sweeps and updating their navigation in real time, which requires a level of manual engagement that most automated systems cannot replicate reliably. I had spent about 8 months running cargo through the passage 4 years ago, before I found the refinery colony route. 8 months of real-time manual navigation through a gravitational environment that had a personality. Difficult and specific and alive in a way that open space never is. I had not enjoyed it particularly, but I had learned it the way you learn anything you have to do every day for 8 months. The Vreth fleet was positioned on the standard corridors. Those corridors exist because they are the cleanest routes through the passage, The paths where asteroid density drops enough that standard navigation systems can handle the transit without constant manual correction. They are predictable. They are where any vessel using standard navigation would go. I went the other way. The Deep Passage transit took me through a region that the informal contractor network called the Tangle, which is exactly what it sounds like. Dense asteroid concentration, competing gravitational pulls from three significant bodies in unstable co-orbital relationships, debris fields from mining operations that had been abandoned without clearing. Navigating the Tangle required full attention for approximately 4 hours. I gave it full attention. I did not speak to Eshkar during those 4 hours, except to tell him at the start that I needed him to be quiet, and to tell him at the end that we were through. He had been quiet. He had also, I noticed, been watching the sensor displays with the focused attention of someone who was tracking every decision I made in real time. Learning the approach, maybe, or verifying it against whatever tactical knowledge he carried from his fleet service. When I told him we were through the Tangle, he said, "You navigated that without slowing below operational approach velocity." "Slowing down in the Tangle is worse," I said. "Lower velocity means less response authority. You need momentum to correct quickly. Fleet doctrine for the passage recommends a 40% velocity reduction in high-density regions. Fleet doctrine for the passage is written for ships that use automated navigation," I said. "Automated navigation needs the time the reduced velocity buys. I don't." He was quiet for another moment. Then he said, "Can I tell you what is in the canister?" I had not pushed him on this since the cargo bay. But we were 4 hours past a navigation challenge that I had handled in a way that clearly told him something, and the offer was coming at his initiative, not mine. That was meaningful. "Yes," I said. He told me. "His name is Vorath Kun. That is the Vreth fleet admiral who commanded the Grand Hunt. Before he was an admiral, he was a fleet commander, and before that, a divisional captain, and 31 years ago, when he was a divisional captain commanding 3 vessels in the outer expansion zone, he issued an order. The order was for the orbital bombardment of a settlement on a Union-registered colony called HFY. The settlement was civilian. The bombardment was conducted without prior warning, without evacuation protocol, and without any of the treaty-required documentation that would have made it a legal military action under the Outer Rim Accord. 460 people. The settlement had 460 people. The Vreth Dominion classified the event as a military engagement. They classified it under a category in their military records that is equivalent to what the Union calls contested territory action, which is a sufficiently vague designation that it does not require detailed documentation at the treaty level. The classification buried the event. No investigation was opened. Vorath Kun was promoted within 18 months. What was inside the canister was documentation that undid the burial. Vorath Kun had signed multiple orders in the days surrounding the HFY action. He had signed requisition orders for the bombardment munitions that specifically described them as being for use against a civilian settlement, using language in the Vreth military request system that was unambiguous. He had signed post-action reports that described the settlement's destruction in operational terms that contradicted the contested territory classification. He had signed communications to his superiors that described the action in terms that the Vreth military code itself defined as war crimes. Cora Fell had spent 6 years collecting those documents. She had worked as a Union diplomatic archivist. She had access to the record systems of 4 different treaty signatories. She had used that access quietly, carefully, building the documentation set piece by piece, keeping everything on an offline system that she never connected to any network she did not personally control. The signed confession was not a confession in the sense of a voluntary admission. It was an accumulation of official documents that, read together, constituted proof. Proof that the action had happened the way the survivors said it happened. Proof that Vorath Kun had ordered it. Proof that the Vreth government had covered it by reclassifying the event's designation after the fact, which meant it was not just a war crime. It was a covered-up war crime, which under the Outer Rim Accord was a treaty violation that carried mandatory conclave review and the potential for government-level sanctions. If the canister reached the conclave, Vorath Kun's career ended. His government faced conclave sanctions. The Vreth Dominion's position in the current treaty negotiations collapsed entirely. The people on HFY got, if not justice, then at least the record. That was what I was carrying. That was why they had declared a grand hunt. I sat with this for a long time after Eshkar finished. The cockpit was quiet. The sensor board showed clear space ahead, the passage behind us, the jump point 4 hours out. You processed the intelligence intercepts, I said finally. You knew about this for how long? I became aware of the scope of the documentation approximately 2 months before the hunt declaration, he said. I was assigned to monitor Union diplomatic communications for any reference to HFY. The name appeared with increasing frequency in encrypted traffic. I informed my superiors. My superiors accelerated the operation to intercept and destroy the documentation before it reached the conclave. But you're not helping them do that. No, he said. Why? He was quiet for a moment. 460 people, he said. That is not an operational loss. That is not a contested territory action. He paused. I have a daughter. She is 7 years old. She attends a settlement school. He stopped there. He did not need to finish the thought. It finished itself. I did not say anything. There was nothing to say that would add to that. Outside, the system's star was a dull orange disk at this distance, throwing flat light across the sensor display. The jump point was 4 hours out. Between here and there, and between there and the conclave, there was a declared grand hunt, 24 warships, and an admiral who had committed an atrocity and spent 31 years making sure no one could prove it. Cora Fell had taken 6 years to build the proof. She had trusted a stranger in a docking corridor with it. She had probably not survived doing so. I thought about her the way I think about most things that I cannot fix and cannot undo. Directly, without looking away, for exactly as long as it takes to understand the shape of the thing. Then I put it away in the part of my mind where I keep the things that require being carried, rather than solved, and I went back to the work. The Ansible relay in System 5 was operated by an independent contractor collective, which meant it was not monitored by any government, and not accessible to Vreth intelligence operations under the Outer Rim Accord's neutrality provisions. It was, in short, a clean relay. I sent a transmission. This one was not in code. I sent it to a public conclave address that is on record as the receiving point for urgent diplomatic communications, and I described the canister I was carrying in explicit terms. Registered diplomatic consignment. Sender: Cora Fell, Union Diplomatic Archivist. Recipient: Interstellar Conclave. Cargo: documentation relevant to Outer Rim Accord Treaty Compliance Review. Currently in transit, under Grand Hunt Pursuit. Ship registry: Freight Vessel Immovable Miriam. Earth Fleet Civilian License. Currently in System 5, Orith Passage. I sent it in the clear, unencrypted, on the standard diplomatic frequency. Not because I thought it would reach the conclave cleanly. The Vreth were monitoring diplomatic frequencies. They would intercept this within minutes. That was exactly what I wanted. Eshkar read the transmission as it went out. He turned to look at me. You just told them where you are. I told them what I'm carrying, I said. And I told them the cargo is registered. The registration is on record at 3 treaty signatory archives. Even if they destroy the canister, the registration exists. The registration confirms the cargo existed. They cannot make that go away. He was very still for a moment. You are telling them that the cost of catching you has just increased. The information does not disappear if I disappear, I said. It's logged. It's time-stamped. It's on record. Killing me now puts the spotlight directly on the documentation. Every diplomatic service in the Mid-Rim will start asking what was in that registered cargo. Vorath Kun has spent 31 years making sure no one asks about HFY. What I just sent means asking about it is now inevitable. He processed this. Then he said quietly, "You just made yourself more dangerous to kill than to let run." I made the math change, I said. Yes. It was the right call. I was certain of this. The certainty was not arrogance. It was the product of a very careful calculation, run several times since leaving the Tarath station, tested against every scenario I could model, and arriving at the same result each time. The Vreth could not afford the cost of stopping me cleanly anymore. The hunt would continue, because it had to by their own cultural law, but the calculus had shifted. Eshkar was silent for almost a full minute. Then he said, "I have heard accounts of humans from my intelligence work. Reports, analysis, cultural studies. They consistently note that humans are unpredictable under pressure." "Is that a compliment?" I said. It is an observation, he said. What the reports do not consistently note is the reason for the unpredictability. Having watched you operate for the last several days, I believe the reason is that you approach tactical problems as engineering problems. You change the structure of the situation. You do not fight the existing structure. You rebuild it into something you can win in. I looked at the jump countdown. 3 hours and 40 minutes. The reports your intelligence service wrote about humans, I said. Did they recommend anything? The most recent comprehensive study, he said, concluded with a recommendation that the Dominion avoid direct confrontation with human military forces unless the engagement parameters were controlled in advance. And what did the Dominion do with that recommendation? A very long pause. They filed it, he said. They filed it, I repeated. Yes. I thought about that. Then I went back to checking my fuel reserves and confirming the jump calculation for System 6, because we had 3 hours and 40 minutes until we jumped, and there was no point sitting in the cockpit feeling philosophical when the secondary engine housing still had a monitoring fault that I had not finished diagnosing. Behind me, somewhere in the mid-rims information networks, the story was spreading. The Kalahari Information Collective had the registered cargo description now. So did every diplomatic service that monitored the standard frequencies. So did, almost certainly, the Vreth Dominion's Fleet Command. The information about HES-4 was not yet public, but the existence of documentation about a treaty compliance matter related to a grand hunt was now known. The Vreth had to make a choice. Keep hunting, which kept the spotlight on the canister, or stop, which was culturally and legally impossible for them. They had no good choices left, only the hunt, running forward on its own momentum, carrying everyone with it, including me. 3 hours and 38 minutes to the jump point. Fuel reserves holding. Frame stress normal. Eshkar quiet in the cargo section. The Miriam running smooth and steady through System 5's outer approach. The drive singing in its particular register that I knew well enough to read like a voice. And I listened to it the way I listen to everything, with the full attention of someone who understands that what the ship tells you is the most important information you will ever receive. It was telling me we were holding together. Good enough. System 10 was a trap built specifically for me, and it was beautiful in the way that traps built by intelligent, patient people always are. I did not see it coming. I want to be clear about that. I am good at what I do, and I have been careful at every step of this, and I still did not see it coming, because the people who built it used information about me that I did not know they had, and they built it in the gap between what I thought they knew and what they actually knew. The gap was my backup navigation system. Every freight vessel operating under Earthfleet civilian license is required to carry a backup navigation module as a redundancy measure. The backup module is a sealed unit, tamper-resistant, updated via secure network connection at certified maintenance facilities. I had my backup module updated at a certified facility 11 months ago, which was the last time I had been through a system with a certified facility available. The backup module had been compromised at some point between the last certified update and this month. I do not know exactly when. I do not know which certified facility it happened at. What I know is that for approximately 2 months before this entire situation began, someone had been feeding false historical data into my backup module's chart library in very small increments, too small to trigger the module's integrity check, too consistent to look like corruption, and too cleverly distributed across the chart library to be apparent from a routine review. What this meant, in practice, was that when I crossed from System 9 into System 10, the Orith Expanse, and cross-referenced my paper charts against the backup module as I always do, the backup module showed me an approach vector that was 3 degrees off from what I had drawn on paper. 3 degrees is a small number. In open space transit, it translates to a position offset that grows the longer you hold the vector, and the Orith Expanse is a large system with a long transit to the jump point on the far side. I chose the backup module's vector over the paper chart. The paper chart was 4 years old. The backup module was updated regularly. The backup module's vector was 3 degrees off my paper chart, but it was within the range of variation that star chart updates produce legitimately, because system bodies move, gravitational environments shift, and a 3-degree correction in a 4-year-old chart is not inherently suspicious. 40 minutes into the Orith Expanse transit, I understood the trap. The sensors showed me 31 Vreth warships in a full sphere around my position, not positioned ahead of me, not positioned behind me, surrounding me, from every vector simultaneously. They had been running in silent mode, drives at minimal output, positioned in advance at the coordinates I would reach if I held the backup module's false vector. They had been waiting there, stationary, dark, for however long it had taken to build this. The timing was precise enough that it could only have been planned around exact knowledge of my approach. Vorath Kun himself was on the flagship. I knew this because the flagship hailed me directly, and the voice that spoke was the one I had been expecting since Karath 7. It was a calm voice, controlled, the voice of someone who has been in command long enough that showing anything other than control in a hail would feel beneath them. Freight vessel immovable Miriam, the voice said, in trade standard with a formal register. This is Fleet Admiral Vorath Kun of the Vreth Dominion Grand Fleet. You are surrounded on all approach vectors. There is no transit corridor available to you. No jump point is accessible from your current position without passing through our interdiction envelope. You have the option to surrender yourself and the cargo you carry, in which case you will be treated according to the protocols of the Grand Hunt, which guarantees the physical safety of a surrendered quarry. Eshkar came forward from the cargo section. He stood in the cockpit doorway. He did not speak. I looked at the sensor display. 31 ships. The sensor data was clear and confirmed, and not a product of any system that the Vreth had tampered with, because I had checked every sensor unit personally at my last maintenance stop, after finding the interference module in Palavin's reach. The display was accurate. 31 ships, sphere formation, every jump point in range inside the interdiction envelope. I looked at the fuel reserve, 44%. I looked at the frame stress, within tolerance. I looked at the drive output, nominal. I looked at the communication system, fully operational. Then I opened the hail channel. Admiral Vorath Kun, I said. This is Lena Voss of the freight vessel Immovable Miriam. I'd like to discuss the terms of your surrender protocols in some detail, if you have the time. There was a pause, a brief one. Admiral Vorath Kun was not a person who paused often, based on what Eshkar had told me about his command style. The pause was interesting. You are in an interdiction sphere, the Admiral said. I am offering you a protocol that protects you. I understand that, I said. I'd like to ask you some questions about it, specifically about the timeline. When I surrender under Grand Hunt protocols, what is the standard processing time before I am formally presented to the Hunt's declarant? That is Dominion Fleet Command, yes? Another pause, slightly longer. Processing typically takes between 4 and 8 standard hours. And during those 4 to 8 hours, I said, the cargo I am carrying would be in Vreth Dominion custody. Yes. And the cargo I am carrying is a registered diplomatic consignment, I said, with an open transmission record at multiple relay points, including a public conclave diplomatic frequency, as of approximately 70 hours ago, which means that the consignment's existence, its registration, its origin, and its destination are now on record in the diplomatic communications archives of at least 7 treaty signatory governments. Silence, longer this time. I know what you think is in the canister, the Admiral said. I am telling you that what you think is incorrect. The consignment you are carrying was registered under false diplomatic credentials by a Union archivist who exceeded her authorization. The documentation is fraudulent. That's a very interesting position, I said, and it may even be true. But the way to establish that a diplomatic consignment's documentation is fraudulent is to present the consignment to the conclave for review, not to intercept and destroy it before it arrives. Intercepting and destroying it is, under the Outer Rim Accord, prima facie evidence that the documentation is accurate. Eshkar, in the doorway, made a sound that was not quite a word. His skin banding had shifted fully into amber. You are one person, the Admiral said, in a cargo freighter. I have 31 vessels surrounding you. I am trying to resolve this without further escalation. I appreciate that, I said, and I want to be very clear that I understand the position you're in. The Grand Hunt requires you to pursue. I understand that this is not something you can choose to end, culturally or legally. You have to be here. You have to keep going. I paused deliberately. So do I. You cannot reach a jump point. I know. You cannot break the interdiction envelope. I know that too. Then what are you proposing? He said. And there it was, the thing I had been waiting for since I opened the channel. He was asking me. An admiral of the Vreth Grand Fleet, commanding 31 warships in a perfect interdiction sphere, was asking a freight pilot what she was proposing, because he had run the same calculation I had, and the calculation said that the cost of destroying me had become higher than the cost of negotiating with me, and he was intelligent enough to recognize it. 11 minutes ago, I said, I transmitted a compressed data packet to the relay buoy at grid reference Delta 7 in this system. The relay buoy is connected to the outer rim Ansible chain. The packet contains a partial extract of the canister's contents. I heard it in the ambient audio of the hail, a very slight change in the background sound. Not quite a response, not quite a reaction, something between them. It is a partial extract, I continued. The canister is still sealed. I cannot open it. What I transmitted is the portion of the documentation that is accessible through the canister's external data port, which in a standard diplomatic consignment includes the registration records and the header information from the enclosed files. That header information includes file names, timestamps, and document type classifications. I paused. Document type classifications are standardized across the Union's archival system. The classifications visible in the header are sufficient to inform a conclave review committee about the general nature and category of the enclosed material. Silence. A very long silence. You transmitted this, the Admiral said finally, while we were in communication. I transmitted it about 30 seconds after you began the hail, I said. The transmission time to the relay buoy was 11 minutes, which is why I waited 11 minutes before mentioning it. I could hear him thinking, not literally, because I was on a communication channel and not in the same room, but I have spent enough time in difficult conversations to read silence the way I read sensor data. Vorath Kun was working through the implications, and the implications were not good ones for his position. The partial extract is not the documentation itself, he said. No, I agreed. It is not. If you destroy the canister, the full documentation is gone. The partial extract only tells the conclave that documentation of a certain type existed and was registered. I paused. If the canister reaches the conclave, the full documentation supports a treaty compliance review. One of these outcomes is worse for you than the other. Another long silence. You are trying to make it so that destroying you is not useful, he said. Yes, I said. I am trying to make it so that letting me go is less damaging than stopping me. Those are different things, but they both point in the same direction. Eshkar stepped into the cockpit and sat in the secondary seat. He was watching the hail channel indicator as if it were the most important thing in the room. The skin banding on his forearms was the deepest amber I had seen it. The Admiral's voice, when it came back, was very quiet. You are one person. This is a freight vessel. Yes. And you have managed to make my pursuit of you a more significant problem than the thing I was pursuing you over. I did not answer that directly. I said, Admiral, the people on HES-4 had names. They had families and jobs and children. They had 460 lives between them, and no one has said their names officially in 31 years. What I'm carrying is the proof that they existed, and that what happened to them happened the way they said it did. I stopped. Then I said, I am going to deliver it. Whatever it takes. That is not a threat. It is just what I am doing. The silence stretched for a very long time. When the Admiral spoke again, the register of his voice had changed. Not softer exactly, more deliberate. I cannot end the grand hunt, he said. You understand this. I do. What I can do is exercise command discretion over the engagement parameters. The hunt continues. You will be tracked and pursued, but the interdiction envelope will be released. I looked at the sensor display. For a moment nothing changed. Then, one by one, the 31 warships on the display began to show drive signatures. They were repositioning, not advancing. Repositioning. The sphere was opening. You have exercised your command discretion, I said. I have calculated my options, the Admiral said, and determined that the current situation has developed parameters that require a different approach. He paused. You are not what I expected, Lena Voss. I am a freight pilot, making a delivery, I said. I'm sorry it became complicated. He ended the hail. Eshkar looked at me for a long moment. His banding was beginning to shift back from amber toward the mid-range gray. Not the dark color of sustained anxiety, something I had not seen on him before. He said, in Vreth and then in trade standard. There is a word in our language. It has no direct equivalent in trade standard. The closest translation is something like the nightmare that you cannot fight because it does not attack. It simply continues. Is that what I am? I said. It is what you have made yourself, he said. Yes. I set a course for the jump point. The 31 ships tracked me, but did not advance. They held position as I built velocity, as the jump drive spooled, as the interdiction envelope emptied of tactical pressure. The flagship, Vorath Kun's vessel, was the closest to my course line, and I watched it on the sensor display as I passed. It did not raise its weapons. What it raised, very briefly, was something the sensor board flagged as a short-range directional signal, a signal sent in the Vreth military communication band, on a frequency used for ship-to-ship communication, between commanders of equal rank. Eshkar saw it at the same time I did. He transmitted something, I said. Yes, Eshkar said. He was running the frequency through the Miriam's communication decoder. The Vreth military band is encrypted, but the Miriam carries a partial decoder from my fleet service that handles the lower-grade encryption levels. It took him about 90 seconds. Then he said, "It is in High Vreth, the formal register. I will translate as closely as I can." "Go ahead." He was quiet for a moment, reading. Then, she was never running. She was measuring the distance to the destination and moving toward it at a pace the pursuit could not influence. This is the record of that assessment, for the archive. The jump drive reached readiness. I jumped without waiting. In jump space, I sat very still for a moment and did not think about anything in particular. That is a habit I have. After significant moments, I stop. I let the moment settle, rather than rushing past it into the next calculation. Then I thought about Cora Fell, who had spent 6 years building a case and had trusted it to a stranger in a docking corridor. Then I thought about the 460 people on HES 4, whose names were in the documentation in my cargo bay. Then I thought about how many systems remained. 3. 3 systems to the conclave. I went back to the fuel reserves and the frame stress readings, and the secondary engine monitoring fault that I still had not fully diagnosed, because those were the things I could do something about right now, and the practice of doing something useful is what I have always used to carry what I cannot put down. 3 systems. The fuel would hold, the frame would hold, the canister was secure. We were going to make it. I did not say this out loud. I have a strong professional objection to stating things before they are confirmed. But the calculation was there, quiet and solid underneath everything else, and I trusted it the way I trust calculations that have been run carefully and checked more than once. 3 systems. I pointed the Miriam toward the exit point and settled in for the transit. 2 systems from the conclave. The Miriam nearly died. Not because of the Vreth. Not because of anything I had failed to anticipate or plan for. Because a junior Vreth officer named, according to the fleet communication Eshkar later decoded, Karath Vel, decided on his own initiative that the Admiral's command discretion was wrong, and that the correct response to a diplomatic crisis was to end the problem rather than let it run to its conclusion. He fired a single focused pulse at my port engine housing. I was in transit through System 11, the Dara Reach, running at 60% drive output, not expecting incoming fire because the 3 grand carriers that were escort shadowing me at the time were holding to the engagement parameters Vorath Kun had established in the Orith Expanse. Those parameters had held since the interdiction sphere opened. 17 systems of hunting, and the rules had evolved into something I could navigate. Karath Vel had been watching the information coverage the same as everyone else. The story had gone wide by this point, had become something that species across the mid-rim were following in real time, and he had drawn a different conclusion from the coverage than his admiral had. The conclusion he had drawn was that the coverage was itself the problem, that the solution was to end the source of the coverage, that one shot, from one vessel, at one cargo freighter, would accomplish what 31 ships in a perfect interdiction sphere had not. He was wrong, but he came close to being right, which is its own category of problem. The pulse hit the port engine housing at a glancing angle, which was either lucky for me or unlucky for Karath Vel, depending on how you looked at it. A direct hit would have destroyed the engine and left me without enough drive authority to maintain course control. The glancing hit did what glancing hits do. It transmitted a significant thermal and kinetic load into the engine housing without destroying it. which caused the housing to partially deform, which pushed the internal engine geometry out of alignment, which sent a shockwave through the drive system that knocked out the oxygen recycler in the forward compartment. The oxygen recycler failure was the immediate problem. The Miriam's forward compartment, which includes the cockpit and the crew quarters, holds approximately 47 hours of breathable atmosphere without active recycling. The recycler unit handles carbon dioxide scrubbing and oxygen replenishment. Without it, the atmosphere degrades. 47 hours is a long time, but the jump point for System 12 was 11 hours out, and System 12's transit to the conclave station was a further 22 hours. So the math put me arriving at the conclave station with 9 hours of atmosphere left. 9 hours of margin, that was tight, but it was margin. The drive situation was more complex. The port engine was still operational, but the housing deformation had created a torque asymmetry that meant running the port and starboard engines at matched output produced a course drift. To hold a straight line, I had to compensate by running the starboard engine at 83%, while the port ran at 61%. That created a fuel consumption imbalance that was eating my reserves faster than the transit calculation allowed for. I was going to arrive at the conclave station with less fuel than I needed to dock safely under standard approach protocols. I told Eshkar both of these things. He processed them, then he asked what he could do. The oxygen recycler was a mechanical system with a replaceable filter housing and a compressor unit. The compressor unit had taken damage from the shock wave. The filter housing was intact. The problem was the compressor. I had a spare compressor in the maintenance locker, which I carry because the model I use for this system is not universally available at smaller refueling stations, and a failed recycler in transit is a life-threatening fault. I had never had to use the spare. Now I did. Eshkar's hands are larger than mine and structured differently, with longer fingers and a subtly different joint configuration, which made some of the repair work difficult for him. But there are things in a maintenance space that are easier to do with longer fingers, and he did those things while I did the ones that required a configuration closer to my own. We worked side by side in the forward equipment bay for 2.5 hours. He did not ask unnecessary questions. He followed instructions precisely and adapted quickly when an instruction needed modification based on what he found when he got inside the system. We got the recycler running again at the 1 hour and 50-minute mark. I ran the atmospheric test. The system was operating at 94% of normal function, which was enough. While we worked, the communication system brought me 3 things. The first was a message from Earth Fleet Command, relayed through a military-grade encrypted channel, using an authentication key that confirmed it was genuinely from the command structure and not from a compromised relay. The message was brief. It said, 3 Earth Fleet vessels en route to conclave system. Estimated arrival 36 hours after your expected docking. You are not alone. Hold your course. 3 ships. 36 hours after my expected docking, which meant they would not be in the conclave system when I arrived. They were coming, but they were behind. Too far to help with anything immediate. But the confirmation that they existed and were moving mattered in a way that was harder to quantify than a tactical assessment. It mattered because it meant someone had been making decisions on my behalf, organizing resources, moving pieces, while I was running the course alone. Gwen Harrow's message from Palaven's Reach had said help is coming, but it is far, and it had been far, but it was real, and it was moving. I filed this and kept working on the recycler. The second thing was a communication from the Kelhari Information Collective, addressed to the general public frequency and specifically citing my vessel by name. The Kelhari had been running analysis pieces on the situation throughout the transit, and their latest piece was their most significant one. They had compiled the known documentation about the Grand Hunt, the registered diplomatic consignment, the public transmission I had sent from System 5, and the fleet activity data they had gathered from neutral observers in multiple systems. They had run this against historical records and treaty documentation. The conclusion of their analysis was published in full on the open frequency, with a recommendation that all conclave signatory governments request immediate review of the hunt and the consignment's status. The Kelhari do not make recommendations. They observe. They analyze. They publish. They do not take positions. The last time the Kelhari Information Collective had made a formal recommendation about a political matter was 42 years ago, during the Outer Rim border crisis. The recommendation spread through every diplomatic network in the mid-rim within hours. The third communication was the one that stopped me for a moment. It came through on a frequency I did not recognize, addressed directly to my ship's registry code, and when Eshkar ran the decryption it resolved into Vreth Military High Register, a formal channel. He read it carefully before he translated it. He read it twice. Then he told me what it said. It was from Vorath Kun. It was not long. It said, "The officer who fired on your vessel has been relieved of command. His action violated the engagement parameters of this hunt and contradicted my explicit orders. This communication is transmitted for the record, as a statement of accountability within the Dominion's own command structure. The Grand Hunt continues. Its conduct will be consistent with the protocols I have established." There was one more line. The last line said, "The oxygen recycler failure was reported by our sensors. Your course and velocity indicate that you have resolved the problem. I did not expect otherwise." I read that last line 3 times. Then I set the communication aside and checked the fuel reserve calculation again, because the fuel was still the problem I had not solved. The fuel calculation was not going to work under standard approach protocols. Standard docking approach at a conclave station requires a specific velocity reduction profile that uses more fuel than a direct approach. I did not have enough fuel for the standard profile. I had enough for a direct approach, which the station's traffic control would need to authorize, and which I would need to communicate clearly in advance. The conclave station at Vethmore is one of the busiest diplomatic facilities in the Outer Rim. Its traffic control systems are thorough, and its approach protocols are rigid for good reasons. A non-standard approach request from a vessel under active Grand Hunt pursuit was going to go through multiple layers of authorization review before anyone at the station approved it. I sent the approach request 6 hours before I needed the answer. I included the full context. I included the engine damage, the fuel consumption data, and the technical parameters of the approach I was requesting. I included the registered cargo manifest. I included the authentication records for the diplomatic consignment. And I included a straightforward description of the situation. A damaged freight vessel with a registered diplomatic consignment, low on fuel, carrying a Grand Hunt target who was the vessel's registered pilot, requesting authorization for a direct low-fuel approach to the station, for the purpose of delivering the consignment to its registered recipient. The response came back in 40 minutes. 40 minutes was fast for Conclave Station traffic control. Authorization granted. A dedicated approach lane had been cleared. Station engineering had been notified to prepare for a non-standard docking, and there was a note attached to the authorization, signed by the station's senior traffic control officer, a woman named Petra Vane, which said, "We have been tracking your transit since System 5. Welcome in advance." I read that, and I will not describe what I felt, because some things are felt rather than described, and this was one of them. Eshkar was in the cargo section when I read the authorization. I called back to him and told him we had clearance. He came forward and stood in the cockpit doorway, and I showed him the authorization on the display. He looked at it for a long time. Then he said, "I owe you something." "You've been useful," I said. "That's enough." "I owe you something more specific," he said. "When I boarded your vessel at Kareth 7, I did not tell you everything about my intentions." I turned to look at him directly. The Vreth do not look away when they are being honest. It is not a cultural value. It is a physical response. When a Vreth is avoiding something, their eyes track slightly to one side. When they are being entirely direct, they hold the line of contact absolutely. He was holding it. "I was not only defecting," he said, "I was assigned as an intelligence operative. My secondary function, alongside my communications analysis role, was to maintain surveillance on any contact that the Dominion's intelligence service identified as a potential asset or threat in relation to the HES-4 documentation. I was placed on the carrier at Kareth 7 because intelligence analysis had identified Cora Fell as the likely documentation source and had been monitoring her movements for 8 months. I waited. "When I boarded your vessel," he said, "my assigned task was to identify what you were carrying and report back. The tracker nodes were placed by other operatives. The navigation interference module was placed by others. My function was to get close to you and assess whether the documentation was real and what you intended to do with it." "And what did you assess?" I said. "That the documentation is real, that you will die before you stop moving toward the destination, and that reporting this back to the intelligence service would make no practical difference to the outcome, while costing me my ability to look at myself honestly for the rest of my life." He paused. "I made my choice about the moment I watched you navigate the tangle. A person who flies like that does not fly to survive. They fly because moving toward the destination is the only option they consider." I looked at him for a while. The Vreth do not look away. I hold eye contact when it matters too. "Did you actually have a daughter?" I said. "Yes," he said. "She is 7. She attends a settlement school on the second colony of Vreth Prime's outer ring." "What is her name?" "Rethna," he said. "Tell Rethna that her father did the right thing," I said, "when this is over." He held the eye contact for another moment. Then he nodded, slowly, with the Vreth chin-first inclination that means agreement. System 12, the Conclave System. The jump exit brought me into a space that was absolutely crowded with vessels, Kelhari observer ships in their distinctive white and silver configuration, a scatter of neutral diplomatic transports, several ships I did not recognize belonging to species I had encountered only in records, and at the system's edge, holding position, the shadow of the Vreth escort fleet that had been trailing me for the last several systems. They were there, still running, because the grand hunt did not end until it ended formally, but they were staying at the system's edge. On the long-range communication band, everyone was talking. The approach authorization from Petra Vane had been a public filing. The arrival of the Miriam in the Conclave system was not a secret. Every diplomatic service and information network that had been following this story was now watching the sensors for my signal. I flew the direct approach at reduced velocity, managing my fuel carefully, watching the reserves tick down with the patient attention of someone who has done the math and confirmed the margin and simply has to execute the remaining steps without error. 31 minutes from docking, I received one final communication from the Vreth escort formation. It was not addressed to me specifically. It was broadcast on the open diplomatic frequency, which meant it was for everyone. It was from the flagship. From Vorath Kun. It said, "The Grand Hunt, file number 4471, declared against the freight vessel Immovable Miriam and its pilot Lena Voss, is formally acknowledged by the Vreth Dominion Grand Fleet to have reached its final stage. The quarry has arrived at the registered destination. Fleet elements will maintain position pending conclave review of the associated consignment, as required by Outer Rim Accord protocols." He had used the language of the hunt's completion without using the language of capture or destruction. He had found the legal language that acknowledged the hunt's end without acknowledging that I had won it, because in the hunt's framework there is no winning. There is only the quarry being secured or reaching its destination. I had reached mine. The conclave docking bay was lit up when I made the final approach. Station engineering had cleared a berth large enough for the Miriam with room on both sides, which was unnecessary for a vessel my size but which I understood was deliberate. Room to maneuver in case the engine torque asymmetry caused any issues on the final approach. I did not have issues on the final approach. I brought the Miriam in on the backup engine configuration at a speed that made the station engineering team very focused and very quiet, and I put her down in the berth with a contact force that was inside the acceptable parameters for a non-standard approach. And when the docking clamps engaged and the board went green, I sat in the pilot seat for approximately 8 seconds without doing anything. 8 seconds is not long. It was long enough. Then I ran the post-docking checklist the way I run every checklist, completely and in order, because the ship still needed to be properly secured, and the fuel reserve needed to be logged, and the engine damage needed to be formally documented for the maintenance report. Practical problems. Still real. Still requiring attention. The docking bay was full of people who had been waiting. I could see them through the forward viewport, a crowd of diplomatic staff and station officials and, at the edges, the kind of carefully positioned security that appears whenever something significant is about to happen in a formal setting. I was not ready for any of them yet. I had a delivery to complete first. I went to the cargo bay. The diplomatic canister was exactly where I had secured it, between the enzyme coolant crates that I still had not delivered to the refinery colony at Karath 7, which was still in lockdown, and which I would need to reroute when this was done. I picked up the canister with both hands. It was not heavy. It weighed about 4 kilograms, which is the weight of a standard diplomatic case with thick-gauge insulation, and a sealed environmental unit to protect the contents. 4 kilograms. 12 systems. 23 days. Every warship the Vreth Dominion had been willing to spend. Eshkar was standing at the cargo bay entrance. He looked at the canister. Then he looked at me. "Ready," I said. We went out together. The docking bay had prepared for a ceremony. Someone had decided, somewhere in the layers of conclave administration, that this moment warranted formal presentation, and they had arranged things accordingly. There were officials in formal attire. There was a reception line. There were people with recording devices and people with diplomatic credentials, and people whose function I could not immediately identify, but whose presence clearly indicated that whatever was about to happen had been categorized as significant. I walked through the docking bay doors carrying a 4-kilogram diplomatic canister with both hands, wearing the same clothes I had been wearing for 2 days, because the crew quarters on the Miriam do not have laundry facilities, and I had been too focused on not dying to prioritize changing. Eshkar walked beside me. A conclave security officer moved to intercept him, and I said, clearly and without breaking stride, "He is with me." The security officer adjusted. A man in a conclave secretary's uniform came forward quickly from the front of the reception line. His name tag said Oren Cole, and he had the specific expression of someone who has been briefed on a situation extensively and is now confronting the reality of it, and finding the reality somewhat different from the briefing. He was reaching for the canister before he had fully stopped walking. I did not hand it over immediately. "I need your receiving seal," I said. He blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "The receiving seal," I said. "A registered diplomatic consignment requires the receiving party to authenticate the transfer with their sealed credential. The standard diplomatic transfer protocol specifies that the courier retains custody until the seal is verified." He looked at the canister. He looked at me. He reached into his formal jacket and produced his credential reader, which he held out. I pressed the canister's transfer panel against the reader. The verification tone sounded. The reader displayed his sealed credential, and the consignment's registration number, and the timestamp of the transfer. I handed him the canister. He took it carefully. The way you take something when you have been told it is extremely important, and your hands are aware of this, even if the rest of you is still catching up. "The contents," he began, "will be authenticated by the Conclave Review Committee per standard protocol," I said. "The canister is sealed under Union diplomatic protocols. The Conclave has the registered recipient authority to open it. I do not." "Yes," he said. "Of course." He paused. "Sergeant Major Voss, the Conclave Director would like to speak with you. There is also a delegation from the Union Diplomatic Service, and representatives from—" "In a few minutes," I said. He blinked again. "I'm sorry?" "I'll meet with everyone in a few minutes," I said. "I need to do something first." I turned back toward the Miriam. The docking bay was quiet behind me. The specific quiet of a large space, full of people who have collectively decided not to speak for a moment. I went back up the boarding ramp into the cargo bay, and I stood there alone for a while. The enzyme coolant canisters were still where they had been since Kareth 7, properly secured, still cold, still intact. The cargo bay had a light scuff on the floor, where the one canister had broken its tie-down during the slingshot run. The secondary restraint bracket that Eshkar had sat against for 11 hours of unauthorized transit was slightly dented from the pressure. I ran my hand along the cargo bay wall. The Miriam's hull was warm from the transit. It is always warm from transit, because the environmental system runs slightly hot by the design of the original builders, a fault that I have been meaning to have addressed for 2 years, and that I have not addressed because it requires a full day in a maintenance bay, and I am always either too busy or too far from a suitable facility. I had been flying this ship for 4 years. I knew every sound she made, and what the sound meant, and whether the meaning was something to worry about. I knew the way she felt in different gravitational environments, and how she handled in the slingshot corridors, and how long she would hold at a given drive output before the thermals crept up. She was 47 years old, and she had a cracked secondary viewport seal, and a deformed port engine housing, and an oxygen recycler running at 94%, and a frame stress reading that was elevated but inside tolerance. And she had carried me through 12 systems in 23 days, with a grand hunt on her heels. I stood in the cargo bay for about 4 minutes. Then I went back out. Eshkar was standing at the base of the ramp. He had not followed me in, and had not asked why I had gone back. He looked at me when I came out, and I nodded, and we walked back into the bay together. The next several hours were not simple. They were not dramatic either, which surprised me, because everything leading up to them had been. Delivering something turns out to be a very different experience from carrying it. When you are carrying it, every decision matters. Every calculation is load-bearing. Every moment requires attention. When you have delivered it, you stand in a room full of people who want to talk about it, and you find yourself running slightly behind your own situation, not quite caught up to the fact that the carrying is done. A conclave technical team authenticated the canister in a secure review room within 3 hours of my arrival. The contents were confirmed consistent with the registered documentation. The review committee was convened within an hour of that. Under Outer Rim Accord protocols, a treaty compliance review initiated by confirmed documentation is a mandatory process. It cannot be delayed or deferred by the party under review. The Vreth Dominion's diplomatic delegation at the conclave station made a formal protest. The protest was logged and forwarded to the review committee. The review committee acknowledged it and continued the review. The Grand Hunt was formally dissolved at 1942 Conclave Standard Time on the day of my arrival, by Vreth Fleet Command communication. The dissolution language cited the consignment's delivery to the registered recipient as the basis for closure. In their formal language, this meant the quarry had reached its destination under the Hunt's own rules, which was the only outcome other than capture or destruction that the Hunt's legal framework recognized. I had not been captured. I had not been destroyed. I had arrived. Dissolved. That was the word they used. I thought about it for a while. Oren Cole, the conclave secretary, found me in one of the station's smaller meeting rooms, where I had gone to be somewhere quiet for a while. He knocked before entering, which I appreciated. He sat across from me at the table and told me that the conclave director wished to offer me formal status as a conclave-registered diplomatic courier with the accompanying access credentials and retainer payment structure. He also told me that there was a commission available from the Union Diplomatic Service and that an Earth Fleet officer had arrived on station ahead of schedule and was requesting a meeting. I asked about the commission first. What kind of commission? A formal recognition, he said. The service would like to. I'm not interested in a recognition commission, I said. If there's a paid contract for diplomatic transit work, I'll consider it. Recognition is nice, but it doesn't fix an engine housing. He made a note of this. He seemed to find it refreshing, or possibly bewildering. Both were acceptable responses. The retainer from the conclave, I said. Is it enough to cover an engine housing repair, and a secondary viewport seal, and a full maintenance stop at a facility with frame stress certification? He did some checking. He confirmed it was. Then I'll take the conclave retainer, I said, and I'll need to reroute the enzyme coolant that's still in my cargo bay. The refinery colony at Kareth 7 is still in lockdown, but there's a secondary colony at Kareth 9 that takes the same grade. Can your logistics office arrange the reroute? He made more notes. He was very thorough. The Earth Fleet officer was a woman named Commander Nadia Wells, who had been on the 3 ships that Fleet Command had routed toward the Conclave system 36 hours after my estimated arrival. She had found faster transit than expected, and arrived 11 hours after me, which was still 11 hours after I no longer needed her. But she did not seem bothered by this, and I did not raise it as an issue. She told me that the transmission Gwen Harrow had received at Delphi Station had been relayed up the fleet chain within 4 hours of receipt, and that the decision to dispatch ships had been made at the highest available command level within 18 hours. She told me that the fleet had been monitoring my progress through every available channel and had been making contingency plans for multiple scenarios. She told me that when I entered the Orith Expanse and disappeared off all sensors for 41 minutes, there had been a significant amount of concern at fleet command level. I asked her what happened during those 41 minutes at the command level. She said, "Mostly people standing in front of sensor displays not speaking." I said I understood that feeling. She asked me how I was, not in the way that officials ask it, as a form of procedural acknowledgement, in the way that a person asks it when they actually want to know. I thought about the answer for a moment. I told her that I was tired, and that the Miriam needed work, and that I still had a delivery of enzyme coolant that was now significantly delayed, and that my secondary viewport seal needed replacing before I took her into any transit that involved thermal stress. Nadia Wells looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "I meant, how are you?" "Tired," I said. "I told you." She nodded slowly. "Yes," she said. "I suppose you did." Eshkar met with the Conclave's legal support office and the Vreth defector advocacy group that had representatives at the station. He was formally registered as a requesting defector under the Outer Rim Accord's protection provisions, which gave him Conclave supervised status while his case was reviewed. He would not be returned to the Dominion. This was the framework he had been working toward, and the framework held. Before the review process separated us logistically, he came to find me in the maintenance bay where I was beginning the preliminary assessment of the port engine housing. He stood at the bay entrance in the way he had stood at my cargo bay door 11 hours into his unauthorized transit, visible and still and patient. "I wanted to tell you something," he said. "Go ahead." "In the Vreth language," he said, "there are two categories of what you might call courage. The first is the courage that you perform. You perform it in front of others because it requires witnesses to be real. It is the courage of the formal hunt, of the declared challenge, of the visible act. The second is the courage that you do not perform. It exists, regardless of witnesses, because it is not about the watching, it is about the doing." He paused. "The word for the second kind has no clean translation. But the concept is that it is more rare than the first kind, and more permanent, because performed courage ends when the audience is gone. The other kind does not end." I kept working on the preliminary assessment, but I was listening. "I have been watching you operate for 23 days, he said. "You have not performed anything. Everything you did because it needed doing, and you were in the position to do it. That is the second kind. My people have a word for a person who has it." He said the word in high Vreth. The sound of it was structured in a way that trade standard is not, more layered, more resonant. Then he said, "It does not translate well. The nearest approximation would be something like, one who moves and does not ask for witnesses." I set down my calibration tool and looked at him. "Thank you," I said. He inclined his head in the chin-forward Vreth nod. Then he said, "My daughter is 7. When she is older, I am going to tell her about this. I am going to describe every system we transited, and every decision you made. I am going to explain to her what was in the canister, and why it mattered, and what one person decided to do about it." He paused. "I want her to know what the second kind looks like." He left. I went back to the engine assessment. The Conclave Review Committee took 12 days to complete its initial findings. The documentation in the canister was authenticated in full. The treaty compliance violation was confirmed under 3 separate sections of the Outer Rim Accord. Vorath Kun was formally summoned for review. The Vreth government's internal crisis, which had been building since my public transmission from System 5, became fully visible when 2 Vreth Council members publicly supported the review process and called for internal accountability proceedings. The 460 names from HES-4 were entered into the Conclave's formal record. That was the part of the review committee's initial findings that was not about treaty compliance or political consequence. That was just the record. The names, confirmed, dated, placed in the official archive, where they could not be reclassified or buried again. Cora Fell's name was in the record too, as the documentation's originator, as the archivist, who had spent 6 years building the case that was now official. She had survived the Kareth 7 station lockdown, I learned. The station's emergency medical team had reached her. She was recovering on a Union medical ship and had been informed of the delivery when she was well enough to receive the news. I sent her a message through the Conclave's secure system. It was not a long message. I told her the canister had been delivered and authenticated. I told her the names were in the record. I told her that whatever she had spent 6 years building had worked. She replied 2 days later. Her reply was also not long. She thanked me. She said she had not known who else to trust in that corridor, and that she had made the decision by looking at my eyes and deciding that someone with eyes like that would not stop. I thought about that for a while. I thought about what it means to make a decision like that about a stranger in a docking corridor while you are injured and running out of time. The courage of it. Not the second kind, which does not require witnesses, but both kinds at once. The act of trusting when there is nothing to trust except a single assessment of another person's character, made in seconds. I thought about the 460 names in the record, and the 31 years they had waited. The Miriam went into a full maintenance stop at the Conclave Station's engineering facility on the third day after my arrival. The port engine housing was repaired over 4 days by a team of engineers who were meticulous and thorough, and who told me, when they were done, that the damage had been more significant than my transit assessment had indicated, and that what I had been doing with it for the final 3 systems was, technically speaking, not something the frame was designed to support. I thanked them and did not mention that I had known this. The secondary viewport seal was replaced. The frame stress was professionally assessed and certified. The navigation computer's backup module was fully inspected. The compromised chart library was purged, and a new module was installed with verification at every level. The oxygen recycler was replaced entirely, not just repaired, because Oren Cole had told me the conclave retainer covered maintenance, and I was not going to leave the recycler at 94% when 100% was available. On the 8th day of the maintenance stop, when the engineering team was in the final stage of the hull inspection, I sat in the cockpit of the Miriam and looked out through the repaired viewport at the Conclave Station's docking bay. It was busy. Ships coming and going, diplomatic traffic, freight traffic, passenger carriers, the ordinary movement of a place where important things happen regularly. I had a coffee. It stayed in the mug this time. The magnetic pad was holding correctly, which the maintenance team had also checked and confirmed during the systems review. Gwen Harrow's message had arrived 2 days ago, routed through the standard commercial relay now that there was no operational reason to use coded communication. It was a normal message in the way that messages between us are normal, which is to say it was professionally warm and practically organized, and contained several pointed observations about the commercial impact of a 23-day transit delay, and the adjustments she had made to my freight schedule to compensate. She had rerouted the enzyme coolant delivery to Kareth 9, as I had requested. She had also, she mentioned at the end of the message, sent a formal complaint to the Outer Rim Transit Authority about the Vreth Dominion's interference with registered commercial freight operations, because the unauthorized tracking nodes and navigation interference module constituted interference with commerce under the Accord, and she intended to pursue compensation through the appropriate channels. I found this deeply reassuring. Gwen Harrow pursuing compensation through appropriate channels was the most normal thing in my life, and I had been short on normal things recently. The maintenance team signed off on the Miriam on the 10th day. Full certification. All systems at or above specification. Frame stress cleared. I walked through the ship from the engine housing to the cockpit the way I always do after a maintenance stop, running my hand along the surfaces, feeling the restored geometry, checking the things that instruments confirm but that hands understand differently. She was ready. I filed my next transit plan the following morning. The Kareth 9 delivery first, rerouted through the Turath neutral zone to avoid the Vreth-influenced corridors until the diplomatic situation settled further. Then a cargo pickup at the Delphi Station hub that Gwen had arranged to compensate for the lost freight time. Then back to the standard run, which still existed and still needed doing, because refinery colonies still needed coolant, and freight lanes did not take breaks for diplomatic incidents. I did not apply for the commission. I did not take the formal status offer. I took the conclave retainer, which was a working arrangement and not a ceremonial one, and which came with no title, and required only that I be willing to take registered diplomatic transit work when it was offered and I was available. That seemed correct. That was the scale of it that felt right. On the morning of my departure, Commander Nadia Wells came to the docking bay to see me off. She did not bring speeches or ceremony. She brought coffee from the station commissary, a large one in a sealed travel container, and she handed it to me as I was running the pre-departure sequence. "The fleet would have gotten there," she said. "I want you to know that." "I know," I said. "But you were 36 hours behind." "Yes," she said. "We were." "It worked out," I said. She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "How do you do it?" "I have read the transit logs. I have seen the sensor data from every system you passed through. I have read the Vreth Fleet Command's own assessment of the pursuit, which they were required to submit to the conclave review process. I want to understand how you do it." I thought about this. It was not a question I had spent time on, because it was not a useful question in the moment, and there were always more useful questions available. But standing in the docking bay with the Miriam certified and ready behind me, and a transit plan filed, and 12 systems of completed work behind me, I had time for a less useful question. I don't think about the distance, I said. Distance is a problem that solves itself if you keep moving. I think about the next thing, the next calculation, the next system, the next practical problem. There is always a next practical problem. As long as I'm working on the next practical problem, I'm moving toward the destination. Nadia Wells was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "And when you ran out of practical problems?" "I didn't," I said. "There were always more." I said goodbye to her and sealed the boarding ramp and ran the final pre-departure check. Everything green. The Miriam's drive came up clean and smooth. Both engines balanced now. The torque asymmetry gone. The drive singing in the register I knew. Docking control cleared me for departure. I thanked Petra Vane, the traffic control officer who had sent me the welcome in advance message, and I took the Miriam out of the berth slowly, feeling the clamps release, feeling the transition from station gravity to free space, feeling the ship come alive around me, the way she always does when she is moving. At the edge of the conclave system, the Vreth escort formation was still holding position. Several ships had withdrawn since the hunt's dissolution, but a few remained, and as I passed at transit distance the lead ship, which my sensor board identified as Vorath Kuhn's flagship, broadcast a brief navigational clearance signal, which is the Vreth protocol for acknowledging a passing vessel and granting safe passage. It is a courtesy signal. You use it for vessels you wish to honor with the acknowledgement. I sent back the standard freight pilot acknowledgement, which is a single-tone response on the same frequency. Simple, professional, clean. Then I set my heading for Kareth 9 and built velocity toward the jump point, and the stars arranged themselves the way they always do at approach speed, and the drive rose to its working note, and the sensor board showed clear space ahead, and I was a freight pilot with a delivery to make. That was enough. It had always been enough. I jumped.